Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Volume's good? Excellent. No? Better? Now? Still not? It's good? Okay. My name is Robert Reich. Welcome to an event I've been waiting for my entire adult life. An evening with Robert Reich. To make things a bit easier for this introduction, I go by Rob and he goes by Bob. The story behind tonight's event begins some 25 years ago. In my sophomore year at Yale University, I was writing a paper on foreign policy, and imbued with the sense of youthful and unearned entitlement that an education at a place like Yale or Stanford specializes in developing, I decided I would just try calling the office of my home state senator, Democrat Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey. I naively imagined that he'd just pick up the phone and answer a few questions about my research. Instead, of course, I got his receptionist. So I left a message. Getting his receptionist should not have been a surprise. But what was a surprise was when my dorm room phone rang 10 minutes later. It was Senator Lautenberg eagerly returning my call. Bob, good professor, how can I help you? Boy, was he disappointed to learn that he had reached some punk college kid, Rob Reich, not Robert Reich, the distinguished professor at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And that was the first moment I realized that my name was not all mine. That I had a doppelganger, an eminent American intellectual, a Rhodes Scholar, and a soon-to-be US Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Indeed, a giant Robert Reich. 25 years later, not a month goes by where I show up to give a lecture, sometimes in spaces just like this, without people in the auditorium or in the audience frowning slightly, puzzled at who has appeared at the podium. They start digging around in the program or whispering to their neighbor, "He doesn't look like the former Secretary of Labor." I've barely opened my mouth and already I'm a total disappointment. They were expecting someone else named Rob Reich. So tonight is an assembly of Bay Area Rob Reiches or Rob Reiches. But at its heart, this event is an exercise in public disambiguation. Here, you finally have proof that we are not the same person. Now, true, we're both professors, and we both write about politics and inequality. But sitting here is Berkeley Bob, and here is Stanford Rob, two different Reiches. This is the Berkeley one, who's the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at Berkeley, who Time magazine named one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries of the 20th century, who ran for governor in the state of Massachusetts, who has starred in an award-winning documentary, Inequality for All, who makes folksy YouTube videos with whiteboard explanations of the economy, who is co-founder of the magazine The American Prospect, and who has written 14 books, including the one he'll talk about tonight, Saving Capitalism. Here's the Stanford one. Yours truly, who's a professor of political science, who directs the Stanford Center on Ethics and Society, Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, who sits on the board of the magazine Boston Review, and was written on education, the health of American democracy, about ethics and inequality, and about philanthropy. So you can understand why this is an exciting night for me. All the more so, since the first time I met Bob was just an hour ago when he arrived here on campus. Yet, I feel like I know the man a bit because we've interacted occasionally over the past few years. You see, ever since becoming a professor here at Stanford, and especially since he moved across the country and took up a position at Berkeley, I get email from people who are obviously intending to contact him, the former Secretary of Labor. I dutifully forward these messages along, and so Bob and I have had at least a few amusing email exchanges. Let me share with you just a bit about what it's like, just a little bit about what it's like to have the same name of a much more famous person in one's own line of work. So sometimes I get fan mail. Dear Dr. Reich, I've been listening and watching you on TV for years and reading your articles even more. You really do have all the answers, and you are correct. More dramatically, this. Dear Professor Reich, please come to Iowa. Enter the Democratic cause for a run for the presidency. Now, these are easy to handle. I'll occasionally reply, just for some jokes, I know I do have all the answers. And then I dutifully forward them on to Bob. Now, other messages present different kinds of temptations. Sometimes I receive some exciting invitations to do things that really would be pretty interesting, like being interviewed on NPR, appearing on a television show, talking at the World Bank, going to speak at the Italian Metalworkers Union in Rome. Well, or this one, dear Professor Reich, just a reminder that we need the minutes to last week's political science department. You were the note taker. Oh wait, that was actually for me. Now, it is just a fantasy, I admit, but I like to imagine that Bob also receives email messages that are really meant for me. They might go something like this. Dear Bob, the Nobel Committee invites you to Oslo to receive a medal on your exceptional work. King of Norway. Dear Bob, please come to the Warriors game tomorrow. Courtside seats. Hugs. Beyonce. Hey, Dad, you need to pick us up after school on Friday. Love, Gus and Greta. Now, I'm not exactly sure why my own kids would have the wrong email address for me, but that's just how confusing this whole situation has been. Over the course of the past decade, I've been invited to give a few dozen keynote addresses on books he's written or to speak about his film Inequality for All, New York City, Copenhagen, Washington, D.C., and lots of other places. One time, I received an invitation to give a talk at an investment bank, and the bank offered a $20,000 honorarium. I really almost did accept that invitation. And one day, perhaps, I will show up to an event and just give a talk, even though the organizers clearly mean to invite the other Robert Reich. Now, the ease of confusing me, Stanford Rob, with Berkeley Bob is not always a source of amusement. Sometimes I have to confess it's a little irritating. So a few years ago, I was asked to provide a blurb for a book published by the Harvard Business Review. It was on a topic I knew something about, so I accepted it and I read the book and sent back a glowing short little thing. And I soon received this email from the person at the press. Dear Rob, thanks so much for getting back to me. Unfortunately, I've since realized a mistake on my part. I had intended to contact the Robert Reich who has a new book, Saving Capitalism. I mistakenly pulled the wrong address and neglected to double check, which means we won't be able to use the blurb you sent me after all. Sincere apologies. Another time, I received an email confirmation from the Charles Hotel in Cambridge, Massachusetts, thanking me for choosing the Charles Hotel for my stay there. But I hadn't been there at all. So I forwarded that email on to Bob, and he wrote back, this is actually from him, Dear Rob, just want you to know I appreciate your paying my bill and for the lavish meal I had tonight. But that's really not the worst of it. The government can't tell us apart either. Long ago, I gave a talk at Berkeley, received a small honorarium, and ended up in their HR database. And then when Bob Reich took a job there, the Berkeley controller began paying his salary, but filing it under my name and social security number. I was audited that year, and it took, I kid you not, hours to figure out why the IRS thought I'd earned tens of thousands of dollars from Berkeley. Now, I suppose perhaps this is the kind of wealth distribution or redistribution that Bob will make possible when he answers the pleas of his fans to run for president. So, life in the Bay Area with the name Rob Reich is sometimes amusing, sometimes irritating. Mostly it just introduces confusion. There's a final twist to this whole story. We've seen how NPR, other universities, and the IRS can't tell us apart, but what about Google? Now, if you do a Google search for Rob Reich or Bay Area Rob Reich, here's what you'll find. Who's this guy? It turns out there's a third person named Rob Reich in the Bay Area. He's a really accomplished musician, and he plays gigs all the time. His primary instrument's the accordion. He has an amazing bio. He works with two ensembles, the Rob Reich Trio and the Rob Reich Quintet. He composes songs based on the poetry of E.E. Cummings, and I'm writing, and I don't make this up, he writes pieces for contortionists and trapeze artists at Circus Bella. He performs with the groups Tin House, Todd Sickafoos's Tiny Resistors, Gaucho, Nice Guy Trio. He's performed at the Monterey Jazz Festival, San Francisco Jazz Festival, and in San Francisco at the Herbst Theater, Yoshi's, and Yerba Buena Gardens. Here are two other images of him, a gig that he did a few years ago. And then here's one with the quintet. He's playing this Sunday, April 17th, at the Boxing Room in San Francisco. Now, in contrast to the drumbeat of doom and gloom criticism about the state of American politics that comes from Berkeley Bob and me, Stanford Rob, Accordion Rob is upbeat and joyful. The academic Robs just think grandiose ivory tower thoughts and pretend they're smart so that no one will notice they don't actually have a real skill, like being a virtuoso instrumentalist. So in my fantasies, Accordion Rob gets emails like this. Dear Rob, are you free to play at the White House on Sunday? Michelle and I have this stupid state dinner we have to host for a couple other Rob Reiches, Bay Area twits, and we want to make sure at least the music will be good. Barack. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to say that Accordion Rob Reich is here with us tonight, too. It's a veritable congress of Robert Reiches. So, if you haven't been paying attention, there's Accordion Rob Reich, the rock star musician. There's Stanford Rob Reich, your host. And there's Berkeley Bob Reich, the former Secretary of Labor. So, on a somewhat more serious note, here's the format for the evening. Bob Reich is here as a part of two separate series sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Society. One is called the series on ethics and democracy, lots of different programming going under that title. He's also here as part of the Arrow Lectures, which are named for Kenneth Arrow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist and emeritus professor here at Stanford. I'm also really pleased to say that Ken Arrow is here tonight with us too. Ken. So I'm going to wrap up my introduction now. Bob Reich will come and talk for 20, 25, 30 minutes about his book, Saving Capitalism. The presentation is called Capitalism and Democracy. I'll return to the stage for some conversation with Bob. And once you've had enough of us egghead Robert Reiches, we'll treat you to some music by Accordion Bob at the very end. We'll end at 8:30 sharp. Berkeley Bob will be outside signing books. Accordion Rob has some CDs to sell. I have nothing. Would you please join me in welcoming Robert B. Reich, or Berkeley Bob, to the stage?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Rob. Rob, is that your name? Rob. Of all the introductions I've had, that's the most recent. No, I was wondering, as you spoke, I realized Frank Lautenberg, the senator from New Jersey, never returned my calls after, and I now know why. I pronounce my last name Reich, and I answer to anything except wretch. I draw the line at wretch. I have so many things to say about you, but I'm going to resist them. I want to tell you how pleased I am to be here and how honored I am to be here giving a lecture named after one of my true heroes, Ken Arrow, not named Robert Reich or Rob Reich or anything like that. Ken, thank you for everything that you have contributed to economics and philosophy over the years. A true towering intellect. Well, here I am at Stanford. I didn't really. Actually, I came here to listen to your lecture. I saw a poster, and to also hear an accordion. Reich. Let me begin by saying there is so much to talk about. There are two people who are running for president, or at least for nominations. One is named Donald Trump. The other is named Bernie Sanders. There's also somebody who I've known since she was 19 years old, named Hillary Clinton, and a few others. And what I would like to do, what I propose to do in the next 20 minutes, if I can possibly do it in 20 minutes, is to talk about what's happening in American politics and weave it together with some of the themes that I've been trying to develop, particularly in my last and most recent book. And maybe the way to begin is to tell you that I went on a book tour. Does anybody have a copy of my, oh, good. Thank you. This is Robert Reich. I went on a book tour last fall, and I asked my publisher to send me to places where I normally don't go on book tours. I didn't want to go to, New York and Boston and San Francisco and Seattle and the normal place in Chicago. I wanted to go to red cities in red states. And they sent me to Cincinnati and to Kansas City and to Birmingham and all kinds of places where I really didn't normally try to sell books. And I normally didn't talk to people, and people didn't normally have a chance to talk to me. And I had some fascinating discussions. Particularly in audiences who describe themselves. I'd say, how many of you, I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands, how many of you describe yourselves as conservative Republicans? And almost all the hands would go up. How many of you would describe yourselves as Tea Partiers? And most of the hands would go up. And I'd say that's so interesting because I don't have a chance to talk to you, and you probably don't have a chance to talk to me. Let's do an experiment here. And we'd have a discussion. And in last September and October, I asked them, again, in groups that were maybe about half the size of this group, but sometimes larger, I'd say, who are you interested in with regard to president? Now, this is just really early on in the presidential campaign. And again, they would tell me that they were trying to make their decision between, on the one hand, Donald Trump, and on the other hand, Bernie Sanders. And I would try to understand that. At first, it didn't make any sense to me. But as I went from city to city and had more and more of these kinds of discussions, it started to make more and more sense. Because people would start talking to me about, and I'd hear this phrase or this word all the time, crony capitalism. And by crony capitalism, they meant a kind of system that was unfair, that was rigged against them. And it was rigged by the moneyed interests, by big corporations and the very wealthy and Wall Street. And I would hear arguments that could have easily come out of the mouths of several people here I know in the Bay Area, or for that matter, Bernie Sanders. Now, they didn't like the title of my book because they said that it sounded as if I was criticizing capitalism. Why should you want to save it? It's a good system. It's just been corrupted by crony capitalism. When I got back here, a lot of people said, we don't like the title of your book. Why should capitalism be saved? So there were differences. But what I began to see, and as I pored over polls and began to understand a little bit more about the dynamic of this election, it seemed to me that something that I'd predicted in that book was coming true, and that is that the big divide in American politics was not Democrats versus Republicans. It was anti-establishment versus establishment. Outsiders versus insiders. People who felt that the game was not only rigged against them, but that the rigging per people were inside the political system versus people who were fairly comfortable or at least didn't quite have that sense that the game was as rigged against them. Now, as many of you know, the typical middle-class family, the median income of the typical middle-class family, adjusted for inflation, is below what it was in the year 2000. Now, this is unusual in American history, apart from the Great Depression, because we have become accustomed, at least in the post-war era, to moving up. Most of the economic gains, at least over the last 35 years, have gone to people who are quite well off. And on top of that, you have a lot of people who are very insecure about their jobs, their work. 2/3 of Americans are living from paycheck to paycheck. And more people don't know how much they are going to be earning next month or even next week. So there's a degree of insecurity out there and a degree of expectations that are not being met. Now, when I say median, I'm not talking about average, and it's important to separate the two. Average incomes are going up, but you know, the basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'2". Do you get my drift? Averages are pulled up by people at the top. What you really want to look at is median, half above, half below. And that's where the expectations of many people have been thwarted because their parents, growing up in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, had seen a dramatic increase in incomes. Now, what does this mean for many people in this country? It means, as Hillary Clinton said, and it's interesting, Hillary Clinton, who to many people represents an establishment figure, an establishment candidate, she said in her first speech announcing that she was running for president, she said the deck is stacked in favor of those at the top. Now, this is a candidate for president closest we have to an establishment, at least in the Democratic side. The deck is stacked in favor of those at the top. The rigging of the economy is something that people really do believe has occurred. Are they correct or are they incorrect? Well, I was a member of Bill Clinton's cabinet. As I alluded to before, I've known Hillary since she was 19. I'm going to tell you something. Could you keep it in this? Will you promise to keep it in this room if I tell you? I went out on a date with Hillary Rodham. Do you want more? I'm not going to give you much more, but I almost forgot that. In 2008, when she ran for president, a reporter for the New York Times, called me and said, we found a bunch of her letters from college, and she mentions that she went on a date with you. And is there anything that you can tell me about that date that might shed light on how she would perform as a president? I didn't remember the date, but I thought, oh, you know, if I say I don't remember, that's not very good. But what can I say? And I thought that was a silly question. So with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek, I said, well, we went to a movie and she wanted an inordinate amount of butter on her popcorn. And then there was silence. I said, are you still there? And he said, oh, yes, I'm just writing all this down. I have a great deal of confidence in her. I think she would be an exceptionally good president. Then why am I supporting Bernie Sanders for president? You might wonder. Well, I'll get to that. But I wanted to at least put a marker down there. Because one of the problems we have, it seems to me, is that over the last 35 years, much of the actual machinery of governance, and by that I mean not only Congress, but also the regulatory agencies, and to some extent the court system, has been taken over. And when I say taken over, I don't mean in any coup d'etat. I simply mean, in terms of influence, been taken over by big corporations and also Wall Street and also wealthy individuals. When I started working in Washington for the first time, I got my first job in Washington when I was an intern. I was an intern in college. I worked for Robert F. Kennedy in his Senate office, and I was in charge of his signature machine. I did that for months. I was bored out of my mind. I just, you know, do you remember, does anybody remember the signature machines? They were these long wooden handles at the end of little motors with a pen at the end, and you had to take the stack of letters that the secretarial pool had done and put them in and line them up and get them right, just right. And I did that. I was so bored. One night I snuck in and I wrote to my friends on the senator stationery, you know, dear Mr. Dworkin, congratulations on having the largest nose in New York State. And then I put it in Robert F. Kennedy. But Washington in the late 60s was a seedy place. There were not the fancy restaurants and beautiful hotels. Pennsylvania Avenue was kind of, well, it was not the kind of place you wanted to be walking on any time of day. And then I, years later, worked as Director of Policy Planning for the Federal Trade Commission. It was still seedy. Occasionally, lobbyists wanted to take me out to lunch, and I, in those days, was naive enough not to say no. I said yes, but I was smart enough to take them across the street to a little cafe called Barney's. And Barney's on Pennsylvania Avenue was noted for the cockroaches that would be all over and I never saw the lobbyist again. It was a very easy way of avoiding the influence of lobbyists. You take them to Barney's. Most members of Congress, only 3% in the late 60s and early 70s, only 3% of retiring members of Congress went on to become lobbyists. Today, by contrast, not only is Washington a luxurious city, but you have about 50% of retiring members of the Senate and 42% of retiring members of the House go on to become lobbyists. Now, this is not because they are less inclined or have more scruples or less scruples about taking advantage of their friendships and the power they had. No, it's because of all the money. Money is what has corrupted Washington. And most of the money has come in from big corporations and Wall Street and from very wealthy individuals. And that kind of money is not being met and has not been met by countervailing power. John Kenneth Galbraith, somebody who I befriended years ago, was something of a mentor toward me, wrote a book in 1952 called American Capitalism. And the subtitle was The Concept of Countervailing Power. And what Ken Galbraith understood in the 1950s was one of the reasons America had done so well in not succumbing to fascism or any other form of totalitarianism or even communism during the first half of the 20th century was because we had, and he thought especially after the New Deal, we had in the United States a system of countervailing power, countervailing the large corporations and Wall Street and also the very rich were labor unions. And not just labor unions, but also local and regional banks. And not just labor unions and local banks, but also small retailers and small businesses. And he went through a whole list. His notion was that politically and economically, all of these countervailing sources of power balanced out the American system. And many of them he traced to the New Deal in terms of creating the opportunities for these countervailing systems of power to organize themselves. By the mid-1950s, in the private sector in the United States, 35% of American workers were in trade unions. Today, in the private sector, it's fewer than 7%. Look at finance. We don't really have local and almost have no state banks any longer. They are now all absorbed into huge national and global banks. Local retailers struggle against national chains and also against Amazon. Wherever you look, you find the decline over the last 45 years of what might be called countervailing power. And you have simultaneously the buildup of huge amounts of political influence. Martin Gilens and his colleague Ben Page, and Marty is here at Stanford on leave. I just saw him. Where is he? Hi, Marty. Has done groundbreaking work. Even before Citizens United, I would put Citizens United, that Supreme Court case, right down there with Dred Scott and a couple of other ignominious Supreme Court cases. But even before Citizens United, what Marty found was that the average citizen had very little, if any, influence on any decisions made in Washington. It was mostly big business, big corporations, not even labor unions. It was basically where the money was coming from by the 1990s, by the early part of this century. And I saw it in Washington when I was Secretary of Labor. One of the first things I tried to do as Secretary of Labor is get a rule having to do with an injury, repeat motion injuries that many people sitting behind computers were dealing with, and trying to get employers to actually pay attention to these employees' needs. And you would have thought that I had declared war on American business. I couldn't get anywhere with that, or with much else that we tried to do. And that was the mid-1990s. That was before Citizens United. It is much worse now. And it is not simply a matter of getting subsidies, big agriculture, big finance, bailouts. It's also a matter of the rules of the game. We pay in this country more for pharmaceuticals, for example, than the citizens of almost any other industrialized country. Why do we pay so much for pharmaceuticals? Well, one reason we pay so much for pharmaceuticals is because the industry is very powerful and has got rules and laws and regulations that make it very hard for regular consumers to do better. We can no longer get our pharmaceuticals from Canada, for example. It's also legal in this country. It isn't in any other advanced industrial country. It's legal in this country for pharmaceutical manufacturers, when their patent is about to expire, to go to the generic manufacturers who would otherwise jump in and say, we will pay you to delay your introduction of the generic version, so that our patents and our monopolies are continuing. The pharmaceutical industry got from the Obama administration a guarantee that the government would not use its bargaining leverage under Medicare to reduce drug prices. And all of that means we're paying a lot. That's called a redistribution upward from the paychecks of average working people to the pharmaceutical executives and big shareholders of the pharmaceutical industry. But it's wherever you look. It's also internet service. I mean, can you imagine? We have in this country the most expensive internet service of any advanced industrial country, and one of the slowest internet services. Why do we tolerate it? Because most of us don't have any choice of internet service provider. This is unlike most other industrialized countries. Why don't we have choice of internet service provider? Well, does it have anything to do with politics? Class? Yes. What about airlines? I mean, fuel prices have gone way, way down. Why is it that airline ticket prices have not dropped nearly as much, even though fuel prices are the #1 expenditure of the airlines? Why is that? Class? It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there are far fewer airlines now. 15 years ago, there were 12 major airlines. Now there are 4 major airlines. Why haven't the antitrust authorities blocked more of those mergers? Does it have anything to do with politics? Class? You can go industry by industry, and you find a similar story. Bankruptcy laws. I mean, maybe you don't pay much attention, maybe you don't care about bankruptcy laws, but I can tell you most other industrialized nations don't make it so easy for corporations to declare bankruptcy and abrogate their labor contracts in bankruptcy, and also make it easier for average people to use bankruptcy to reorganize their debts. In this country, if you can't pay your mortgage debt, can you use bankruptcy? No. If you have a student debt that is just mounting, can you use reorganization? Can you use reorganization under bankruptcy for your student debt? No. Now, why is it that a major presidential candidate has used bankruptcy 4 times to protect his own assets, but you, with your student debts or your home mortgages that are underwater, cannot use bankruptcy? Does it have anything to do with politics? Of course. And I could go through many other essential building blocks of capitalism, and you would see the same pattern, particularly over the last 35 years. It's not that anybody is acting in a nefarious way, and it's very easy to blame people. This is not about blame. It's about the lack of countervailing power. So what do we do about it? How do we reconstitute countervailing power? Maybe not exactly the same way we did in the 1950s, but is there any way we can reconstitute? And I think this is where I find some reason for optimism. And I'm going to end on an optimistic note. I am an optimist. I find cause for optimism, number one, in American history, because there have been at least 4 times historically where arguably capitalism got off track, and we, unlike other nations and other societies, got it back on track. The first, one might say, although I don't like everything they did, was during the Jacksonian period. When the Jacksonians lashed out about, they didn't dislike capitalism, they just didn't want an aristocracy. And they reformed many of the rules of capitalism, and they expanded the franchise. Or number 2, during the progressive era between 1901 and 1916, where we busted up Teddy Roosevelt, and to some extent Taft and Wilson busted up the great trusts and had some pure food and drug laws and laid the foundation for a lot of the regulatory reforms of the 1930s. And then came the 1930s, and then came what some of you may remember, the 1960s. I'm looking at you, and some of you look like you might remember the 1960s. In terms of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and Medicare and Medicaid, and also eventually the Environmental Protection Act. These are all ways of making sure our political economic system is working for everyone, widening the circle of prosperity. And we will do that again. In every one of these periods, elites decided that it was dangerous to them to have capitalism go off the track. How can it be dangerous to elites? Well, very simply, right now, a lot of wealthy individuals, and I hear directly and indirectly, worry not about right-wing populism or even left-wing populism. They're also worried that the middle class is shrinking. There won't be enough people to buy all the goods and services that they're producing. I had one CEO of a big company in, actually pretty close to here, big high-tech company, come and visit me, wanted to talk about inequality. And I finally asked him, why are you worried about inequality? He said, because I'm looking at all of the ways in which technology is displacing workers, and I'm concerned 20 years from now, who's going to be buying our products? So my first source of optimism is history and the tendency of elites in this country to help reform capitalism. A second source of optimism, to me, is young people. I have had the great privilege of teaching over the last 35 or almost 40 years, people between the ages of 18 and 28. And I have never taught a generation of young people between the ages of 18 and 25 or 28 as idealistic and as committed and as oriented toward giving back and service as the current generation that I am now teaching. And that is a source of enormous optimism to me. And a final source of optimism to me is what's happening in American politics. Now, it is hard for me, given my values, to find much to be optimistic about in the Donald Trump campaign. But let me tell you something. Both Trumpism and also Bernie Sanders have unleashed and made visible to the rest of the country a populism that I believe is fundamentally grounded not in prejudice, not in bigotry, not in isolationism, not in xenophobia, although you certainly find pieces of that, a lot of that in Trump. But its origin is in the kind of economic anxieties and stresses that I have shared with you. In other words, the country is now seeing the results of a political establishment that has not paid adequate attention to these issues. For the last, I guess, 20 years, 30 years, I've been writing about inequality and been talking about it as a trend that is dangerous to us and for us. I don't have to make that case as clearly as I did before because it is all over the newspapers. It is in the media. That is now a well-established point of view. And most, whether you're on the left or the right, see it as a reality. And that, to me, is probably the largest cause of optimism. Because in this country, when we understand the source of a problem, we tend to put ideology aside, to roll up our sleeves, and to get on with what has to be done. And we will. What's going to happen? Let me just tell you, crystal ball. On the Democratic side, I think it is very hard to predict, but I do believe that Bernie Sanders is going to do very well, but probably, the odds are, if you've all been reading the newspapers and also looking at the odds makers, that Hillary Clinton does have those super delegates and also a lot of people who are very supportive of her. On the Republican side, it's going to be very interesting. I think that there will be a brokered convention, and my prediction, you heard it first here, is that Paul Ryan emerges as the Republican nominee. I can tell from your murmurs that that satisfies you enormously. But of all years, political prognostications are most hazardous. This year, no one knows what's going to happen. But please, and I urge all of you, particularly young people, continue to be actively engaged. Do not become cynical about our system. Cynicism is the most damaging and potentially worst outcome of any election season or any attitude toward politics. You have got to be engaged. You've got to be active. You've got to understand that citizenship is more than voting and paying taxes and serving on juries. It is actively affecting our life together. Thank you all. And now we're going to have a conversation between doppelgangers.
Doppelgangers, the doppelganger conversation. The last bit of this, where you're doing some political prognostication, I want to read a passage that stood out to me in your book, which you must have written at some point, 2015, that it seems prescient in light of what you just said as well. So this is from the end of the book. It's likely that in coming years, the major fault line in American politics will shift from Democrat versus Republican to anti-establishment versus establishment. That is, to the middle class, working class, and poor who see the game as rigged versus the executives of large corporations, the inhabitants of Wall Street, and the billionaires who do the rigging. That seems to capture already a year ago, whenever you wrote that sentence, the rising populist spirit, which we now see some of in American politics. Let me ask about the perhaps romantic idealism on which you ended, however. Both historically and thinking in the future, what gives us reason to hope? What gives you reason to hope for a progressive sort of populism as opposed to the xenophobic, racist, isolationist kind of populism that we can see elements of today and both historically?
Well, I don't want to be a cockeyed optimist, Rob. But I do think that when confronted with a choice, that is, when the establishment, including those with a great deal of wealth and power in this country, see that the choice is either, on the one hand, authoritarian populism, xenophobic and bigoted and so on, versus kind of democratic reform populism, I think the choice will become obvious. I think most will find the latter is necessary.
All right, so let me also then pick up a thread, maybe especially relevant for folks here. You teach at Berkeley, teach at Stanford, but both are elite institutions of higher education. And you say, I was interested to hear you say this, that in 40 years of teaching, this is the most service-oriented, idealistic generation you've encountered. And I certainly have experienced some of that here. I don't have 40 years of experience to compare it to, but almost 20, so at least some. There's more political activism now on this campus than there has been at any time I've been here. But I also want to ask whether or not things you also quote here in the book, that at places like Berkeley, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, where a generation ago, 50% of the graduating class applied for jobs on Wall Street or in management consulting firms. And on this campus, and I'm sure the same is true over at Berkeley, students have voted with their feet to go major in engineering and computer science in overwhelming numbers and seek jobs in the tech sector. To put it perhaps cynically, a lot of students, despite the romantic idealism you describe, are happy to ride an elite education conveyor belt to the 1%.
Well, I think that's been the case. I don't think that's new. I think that since the 1980s, when we began to see huge returns, if you got to Wall Street or if you got to high tech at the highest levels and wherever, there has been naturally a response to that market. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity cost of not responding has been very, very large.
Right.
And then you add in student debt. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know, I don't have the data from Stanford, but I know that a lot of my students are financing their educations, and it's not quite as expensive as here, but still it is expensive. On my book tour, I came across a woman who was just going into retirement, and she started to cry when I talked about student debt because her Social Security checks were being garnished by the government because she co-signed the student debt instrument of her granddaughter. So this is not a small issue. And I understand people gravitating toward the best jobs, quote unquote, that they can find. And yet, at the same time, I am blown away by the number and percentage of students I come across who want to teach for America or want to give back in whatever way they can. Peace Corps, even to this day, they are doing, a lot of my students, there's a self-selection obviously, but a lot of my students who could otherwise do extremely well financially are choosing, at least for a time, to do something else. Mm-hmm. But even those who go to Wall Street or into very remunerative jobs are still want to give back and still publicly service oriented.
The give back attitude takes the form of service, but there's the part of the elemental claim of the book is that economic power has become political power, and once economic power expresses itself politically, it reinforces the economic power in the first place. Is service acting in a political register that gives rise to the populism, or is it the kind of volunteering? Again, the cynic in me, where there's plenty
So we have cynical Rob Reich and idealistic Bob Reich. Here's what makes me think generationally. It's hard. It's impossible to generalize meaningfully about generations. But if you look at the data on the Democratic primaries, the thing that pops out at you is that the people who are voting for Bernie Sanders are overwhelmingly described as young. Yeah. Now, they describe young as under 44, right, which strikes me a little odd. Right. But he's cleaning up in terms of under 44, and it seems to me that's not accidental.
Yeah.
That is, that there are a lot of people who are under 44 who want a major change, right, in our system and feel like they don't want to grow up, and they don't want their children to grow up in a system that is as corrupt, yeah, as the current system.
Let me ask you about that too. The numbers that you described, younger generations overwhelmingly, massively supporting Bernie Sanders, and I think it's just lockstep. The older you get, the more likely you are, if you're a Democrat, to support Hillary. Lots of people talk about how what's going on the Republican side, especially with Trump, represents some reconstitution or upheaval within the Republican Party. But I wonder if you think, just in the Republican side, people are voting all over the place. There's lots of different candidates, fewer today, but still lots before. On the Democratic side, it's been two, and it is unusual to see just how overwhelming the age distribution, or what your age is, how strongly it predicts who you vote for. Does that suggest something about turmoil within the Democratic Party as we look to the near-term, middle-term future?
Yes, I think it does. Now, I was there in 1968. I was clean for Gene. I organized different states for Eugene McCarthy, mm-hmm, anti-war candidate, and I'd worked for Robert Kennedy. The last time the Democratic Party faced this kind of a controversy or fissure or dilemma was 1968. And that was not pretty. Right. The Republicans are in worse shape. The Republican Party really is now in a kind of disaster mode. There are a number of people I know who are old-line Republicans, who are establishment Republicans, who don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. They don't think that the party represents anything that they value, and they don't know where to turn. So I think in both parties we're seeing something of an inflection point. It's hard to tell where this is going to lead, mm-hmm, but undoubtedly the progressive, and it's not even fair to call it progressive, the populist, both the authoritarian populist and also the democratic populist forces that have been unleashed, I don't think are going to fit back in a bottle.
Uh-huh. If it turns out what you've predicted on the Republican side, that Paul Ryan becomes the nominee, presumably through some type of backroom dealing at the convention, a brokered convention, what's the impact of a decision like that on the populist uprising, or the swell behind the Republican candidate, Trump in particular, if the elite establishment maneuvers to put an establishment candidate on the ballot?
Trump could very easily start a third party, although it's going to be late. It's going to be very hard for him after the nomination to do that. But I wouldn't be all that surprised if he then aimed for the 2020 election, mm-hmm, even though he'll be somewhat old, and started a third party or a third party effort. I'm surprised at the number of Sanders supporters who are also talking about a third party. Now, you and I both know, and most people in this room know, that makes no sense from the standpoint of electoral success. Right. You just take votes away from the party that is closest to you. And yet, I think that there would be maybe a 20% probability that we could see, if both establishment wings of both parties neglect this populist upsurge, the beginnings of a third party movement over the next 8 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm. One more thing on Paul Ryan. So if the audience heard it here first, the prediction, of course, reading the newspaper today, he declared that he would not be a candidate for president.
And actually, I was only 90% sure he was going to be a candidate until I heard that he declared that he would not be a candidate today. You remember he said under no circumstances would he be Speaker of the House. You remember that? It was, I mean, within our memories. So when a candidate, when a politician says out of the blue, there's no way that I'm going to do something, you know that's a very good clue that person is obsessing about doing exactly that.
Okay, I've got one more line of questions or questions about the book, and then I want to open the floor to a few questions from the audience in just a couple minutes. One of the solutions or reasons for optimism that you described here on the stage, which you didn't mention but is in the book, is what you describe at the very end as a citizen's bequest, or what sometimes is called a universal basic income. And this is an example not of redistribution, but of pre-distribution, the idea that every citizen is entitled to some amount of money on an annual basis, or the details could be worked out. Say a little bit about a citizen's bequest and how it would work. And in particular, I want to ask as well about the interesting political forces that it's unusual political bedfellows who might be mobilized to support this.
Yes, I don't think we're going to see this anytime soon.
Yeah.
I mean, Switzerland is now playing with this. Other countries are thinking about it. It is on the agenda in other countries mainly because they're facing very high unemployment. Some of it is structural, some of it is technological, and they say to themselves, wouldn't it be better, rather than having categorical programs for the poor, just to give somebody a minimum income that will at least keep them out of abject poverty. Mm-hmm. This idea is not a brand new idea. This idea actually was very conservative. Right. Milton Friedman and others. Murray. Hayek supported this. So you do have strange bedfellows. Right. It's still at a theoretical level, but I think that as we move down the road toward more and more technological displacement of jobs, we are going to see more support for a minimum guaranteed income.
Well, I don't know if this was the conversation with the Bay Area tech firm that you were referring to before, but a local outfit here that all of the undergraduate students know, and even the tech community knows, Y Combinator, has announced that they're going to devote millions of dollars not merely to research on universal basic income or minimum basic income, they also want to run experiments on it. Some random controlled trial. Some people get something. I don't actually know the details. I'm not sure they know the details yet. But you said before that the motivation for it was, unless people have some money, the products that the tech companies have for sale, there won't be an audience or a consumer base to buy it. It sounded like just now you also thought that it was a kind of early defensive posturing, because if the tech products themselves are what displace the workers in the future, artificial intelligence, automated automobiles, whatever it turns out to be, maybe they better get ahead of the curve in order to get behind a political program like minimum basic income.
Well, it could be both. That is, I mean, if I have let's assume, for just the sake of a thought experiment, I have a little imaginary device in my hand, and we'll call it an I everything.
Right.
And it's capable. You can say whatever you want to your I everything, and it produces it. 3D manufacturing, whatever. Now, if you have an I everything that can literally do everything, nobody will be able to buy it because nobody will have a job. Mm-hmm. So you need a way of recirculating money in your system. Now, this is fanciful, obviously, but I think an argument can be made, given the direction we're going. People are still going to have jobs, but they're going to be in the service sector, and that service sector jobs, very low productivity. They're not going to generate very much income, right, and they're not going to generate enough income for people to afford a lot of the technological gadgetry and everything else that is going to be for sale in the economy. You've got to have something like a minimum basic income or a universal basic income. And so defensively and also proactively, it may be in the interest of high tech and others to get behind it.
Has it come up just out of curiosity with the young people you've describing, perhaps in the red states you visited during the book tour, this idea? Or is this the theoretical idea that hangs off the end of the book, but around which there's as yet no real political constituency?
Let's put it this way. I am surprised over the last, I actually wrote this book 2 years ago, given that publishing is still in the Stone Age and there's a 9-month gestation period between the time you finish a book and the time it's out. I have been surprised at, over the last 2 years, how much interest there is in a minimum basic income.
Is that yours?
Yes, it's the president again, and I keep on telling him.
Maybe it's Rob here. He wants to get on the stage. We'll get you here soon. Okay, let's use this moment then to open up the floor to questions. There are mics that are going to circulate. If you raise your hand, we have time for a few questions before we invite Rob Reich to take the stage for a bit. There's a question right there. If you could give your name and then offer your question, that'd be terrific.
Sure. My name is Sporzu Sohrab. I'm curious, as a Bernie Sanders supporter and the divided government that exists, how would his policies and agenda have a likelihood of success? And therefore, how could his supporters be optimistic about the results of his campaign?
Well, I don't think that you would have, if Bernie Sanders were elected president, I think by definition you'd have a different Senate. You might possibly have a different House. That election itself would reflect a degree of organization, mobilization, and energizing of the electorate toward that would overflow, that would have an effect beyond the presidency and affect the rest of the government. And I don't think that's too far-fetched, given the amount of enthusiasm, particularly among the young people under 44, that have been unleashed. But I think, for the standpoint of this discussion, it's more realistic and more interesting to consider beyond the 2016 election. That is, if you take the long view, many of the trends that we're seeing, and I think that's really what my takeaway for you is, are either going to be an authoritarian populism or a democratic populism. And as soon as we recognize that that is the choice in front of us, I think the sooner we as a nation can make the appropriate choice. And I think we will make the appropriate choice.
Go all the way into the back with I think you've got a red shirt on there. Yeah.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Reich. Your documentary inspired me to look much more into inequality. I actually wrote a book last year on those issues, trying to promote that. So I really want to thank you for that. Silicon Valley represents a dramatic concentration of power in a different sense in the technology sector. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, will Silicon Valley become like Wall Street? Will there be similar dynamics as we see in Wall Street, similar problems of corruption? Is that something that you're worried about, and how would we prevent that? What can we do to stop those power mechanisms from being corrupted?
Well, first of all, if you mean by corruption, are you talking about political, just money, the translation of wealth into political power and the compounding effect that I alluded to before?
Well, I believe that would probably be the root, but I think that's probably the root of it, yes. Excessive wealth leading to undue political power.
Well, I think, and again, without being critical of anybody, and this is not about any individuals, and it's not even about industries, it's about the tendency of concentrated wealth and income to have political consequences. And again, we saw this in the late 19th century. Louis Brandeis, the great justice, Louis Brandeis, purportedly said, this country faces a choice between a great deal of income and wealth in the hands of a few or a democracy. So it doesn't matter what industry, and it doesn't matter exactly when we're talking about, that phenomenon is likely. But let me just contrast Wall Street and high tech for a moment, because Wall Street, you're dealing with a lot of rent-seeking behavior, in the sense that much of what Wall Street does amounts to taking money from one set of pockets and putting it into another and collecting a lot as the money passes between pockets. High tech is very different. I think high tech has to do with improving productivity and generating a great deal of products and services that are arguably, hopefully, better, cheaper, faster than what was there before. I do think, though, that the problems of inequality that are associated with high tech are obvious now here on the peninsula. If you talk to people about housing, for example, many people are angry about high tech. I don't think it's the high tech industry's fault, but you see the gap in income widening, and the consequence, particularly with regard to housing, creating a great deal of hardship for many people, and that in turn expressing itself in anger, a kind of populist anger. My advice to the high-tech community here is to get ahead of that curve to the extent possible, to really openly get involved in improving the quality and availability of low-income housing, working on infrastructure issues, improving education and healthcare, so that the high-tech community is not part of the problem. It can be seen as part of the solution.
Take one from over on this side. We got a question right over here. Mic is coming, just hold on a second.
Hi. Today on social media, you suggested that the people who are very impassioned about either Bernie or Hillary should not go off the deep end and really say damaging things each about the other. I wanted to ask you, how seriously do you take the position that Hillary Clinton is in because of her embeddedness with, what we say, Wall Street, the Goldman Sachs fees, the $27,000 a person fundraiser, and that kind of thing? Is that something we Bernie supporters shouldn't be so fired up about, or is that redeemable or irredeemable, or what?
Well, it's all relative. As I said, thank you for reading my social media. You're the one. I was very impressed that I could. What I wanted people to take away from that is that it's all relative. If the Republican, in terms of my values and maybe your values, challenger is Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Paul Ryan, and by the way, Paul Ryan is extraordinarily conservative and doesn't represent my views at all, I would much rather have either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. And to get into a squabble, and I understand why tensions are very high, and because I'm supporting Bernie Sanders, I get a lot of mail every day from Hillary Clinton supporters saying, I used to have a lot of respect for you, Robert Reich, and I don't have any respect anymore. And at the same time, I'm hearing daily, that Hillary Clinton is the most corrupt politician in American history. Well, this is just ridiculous. And I really do think it important, if you are a Democrat, if you share those values, to tone it down and understand that we're going to be in a major general election brawl, and we're going to need each other.
Question over here on the right.
Hi. Arguably, the loss of middle American jobs is due to both automation as well as the movement across the borders. Now, that certainly has lifted the tide in China and other places. Now, since automation is going to be there and probably accelerating, one way to improve American jobs is to start closing the borders, as arguably Bernie and Trump have been doing. Would you argue for that, in which case stabilizing America means destabilizing the third world? How do you draw the line between what is good for the US versus the rest of the world?
I would not support ending trade or retreating from free trade But I do think it important to distinguish between trade agreements of a sort that we've had in this country, particularly starting with the Kennedy round, the big multilateral trade agreements that have been very important to the developing world and also to us. And on the other hand, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is more of an investment agreement than it is a trade agreement. And I think embedded in the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a very damaging loss of sovereignty, not only for the United States, but also for most other countries, in that any global company can go to a tribunal that is independent of any jurisdiction and allege that health or safety or environmental regulations have reduced its profitability and thereby get compensated by an individual country. That is very damaging, potentially, and makes it much more difficult to improve health, safety, or environmental regulations. And I, therefore, think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not in the interest of most people. That doesn't make me a protectionist. That makes me worried about our inability to protect our people with regard to health, safety, and environmental depredations. You understand the distinction?
Let's take one last question over here.
Hi. So you mentioned that there were perhaps 4 different times in American history that you could point to where there was sort of reform of the economy that got us back to center. And the sort of other side of that is that it then left center again. So do you think that sort of the default distribution of wealth is something that comes and goes in cycles, or is it something that we can sort of strive for some optimum state that might at some point be like a steady state?
It's a good question, and I don't mean to suggest, and I didn't mean to suggest, that the distributional issue that we're now struggling with is cyclical. I think there are structural issues that were very, very difficult. Thomas Piketty and others have pointed to the 19th century, particularly in Europe, but also to some extent in the United States, as a time in which great wealth was amassed, and it was very hard politically to do much about it. I think our issue now is very different from that issue then. Right now, we're dealing certainly with concentration of wealth, but it's the concentration of income that is driving inequality today. That's an easier problem, it seems to me, to begin to tackle. So I don't think we're in Thomas Piketty land. I think it's closer to some extent to what we did in the 1930s and 1960s. And therefore, politically, I think it's not easy, but it's an easier political challenge than we faced before. By the way, let me just summarize. I don't mean to suggest, I'm rehearsing what I've said so far today, and I sound very, very positive.
Cynic Rob is
And the last
entering,
thing I want to leave you with is a kind of a quixotic optimism. This is not going to be easy to turn around, but I also don't want any of you, and I'm particularly speaking to you young people under the age of 44, to feel in any way that we are doomed or that this is impossible. It is not. Not only is it not impossible, but the current direction we are heading in terms of our democracy and also our economy, is not sustainable. So something has to give. And the choice really is, in coming years, a kind of authoritarian Trumpism, even if it's not Donald Trump, or something that is much bolder in terms of democratic reform. And that we have to get behind.
All right, so with that, Bob Reich. Hold on one second. So a reminder that at 8:30, Bob will be outside to sign some books. We're going to invite Rob Reich now to the stage.
By the way, if there's anybody else named Rob Reich or Rob Reich, Now's your opportunity to come up to the stage.
We were thinking about only taking questions from people named Rob. So, Rob, we'll give you the stage. Yeah, we'll go. We'll leave. Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Reich. Thank you for coming, everybody. You can meet Rob and Bob outside if you wish. This is